You seem to have a lot of hope for Africa, some developing countries, based on the arrival of these tools to assist them in escaping their conditions and situations, which has to do with poverty, movement of money, being included in the global economy. Yet, if they are not technically equipped to, you know, use these tools optimally, where does your hope come from?
Well, I mean, one of the big factors is because everybody has a mobile phone or probably knows or can get access to a mobile phone of someone that they know, then the remotest villages in Tanzania, in Zimbabwe, in Ethiopia, in Colombia, in Argentina, anywhere in the world can now get access to opportunity. And my favorite story is one of Vijay Shankar Sharma, and he's the guy who founded Paytm in India. And Paytm is a mobile network financial system that has grown to about 300 million people using it in India, which is quite sizable. It's 25% of the population, so it's big. And the company is valued at about $10 billion. The reason I tell the story is that Vijay was homeless 10 years ago. He had been bankrupted by his then friends. He had no money to his name. He tells a story that he would have to work out whether to walk to a job interview so he could eat afterwards, or catch the bus and then not eat, because it was literally that tough a decision. And yet now he's one of the youngest billionaires in India. And that's all because he saw opportunity with the mobile network and the inclusion opportunity and took it. And I'm not saying everybody has that entrepreneurial capability, but I'm saying anybody with any gumption who wants to do something that's entrepreneurial, commercial, creative, now has that opportunity because they can communicate to the world, not just to the village.
Can a society evolve without passing through industrialization?
I think that's the challenging aspect, and that if you look at the infrastructure in Europe and America, nearly all of the infrastructure evolved from the Industrial Revolution and was cemented in place by technology to reflect the Industrial Revolution structure. If you look at India or China or the African nations or South American nations, they're leapfrogging Europe and America because they didn't have any infrastructure and they've started from scratch. And equally they're going tech fin, looking at what can the tech do first rather than taking what was there before and trying to automate it. So what I think will happen this century, and it's already started, is that China will take over from the USA as a superpower, and that's already something that's happening. And then the rise of many nations that historically have been viewed as being less capable, but now have leapfrogged. And someone said to me the other day that Europe's becoming a museum for Chinese tourists. I can quite see that. If you travel around European cities, you quite often see it's just jam-packed full of Chinese tourists.
Have you visited Africa?
Yeah, I've been to many places.
Have you visited some African
I've been
countries?
to Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, and quite a few nations. Yeah.
Nigeria?
No. It's on my list. Well, I've done some work with Diamond Bank, if you know Diamond Bank, which are actually quite a visionary, digital-first oriented bank in Nigeria. And I got 2 invitations to come to Lagos this year, but I didn't manage to organise the dates. I think the only thing I would add to conclude is most of the banks from the industrial era are focused on shareholder and profit. Understandably, because they're big corporations and they have to deliver results. But if you look at the Fintech community, it's astounding how many startups are focused on things that banks just don't deal with, like financial inclusion. Because banks think financial inclusion is charitable. It's not, it's a business. If you look at M-Pesa in Kenya, it's making a lot of money. It's not a charity. And equally, there's a lot of fintech startups looking at financial literacy amongst kids, looking at financial support for the elderly, because they're vulnerable. Looking at the mentally ill who often their mental illness is made worse because they have financial illness. And looking at planet Earth and the environment and sustainability and creating new models that support doing that well. And my favorite example is Ant Financial, which comes out of China. And then they are the company that runs the payment system in China called Alipay, which is over half of all payments use their system in China. We're talking trillions of dollars, so it's big. And they have this game in their payment system called Ant Forest, where every time you pay for something, if you do it in a more sustainable, environmental, green way, you get more points. And eventually, if you get enough points, you have a virtual tree planted as a game in your app. But when you get a virtual tree planted as a game in your app, the company actually plants a real tree in China. They've planted 100 million trees in 3 years. They've got something like 1,000 square kilometers that's now green, and they're reducing carbon emissions in China by about 5% as a result. And that view about doing good for society and good for Earth is pretty much something I see in a lot of the fintech startups, but I don't see in the banks. 71% of the damage to the climate since 1988 has been caused by 100 companies. If we stop funding those companies, then we could change climate change tomorrow.
What's the origin of fintech? How did it come about?
Well, technology in banking has been around for many decades. Back in the 1970s and 80s, people were talking about banking would become just bits and bytes. But fintech came about mainly because the cloud, which allows you to have unlimited scalability on demand, allowed a lot of new companies to launch new ideas. And equally, because of code becoming very easy through application program interfaces, which is plug and play code. So suddenly you could launch a little bit of code that on day 1 might have 1 user, and day 15, 1,000, and day 30, 1 million. And you couldn't do that before the cloud, because you'd have to create all the infrastructure to support that. Whereas now you don't have to create any of that infrastructure, you just let it come.
Do you think the banks are not under some form of threat? Is it not a threat to banks as we have always known banks to be? This fintech revolution.
Well, I wrote the other day that we're going to see the integration of these two markets. So 10 years from now, I don't think we'll talk about fintech and banking. We'll just talk about finance through the network. The reason why we're talking about fintech today is because it started about 10 years ago because of cloud, to redefine how financial services worked by taking every little process in financial services and saying we could do that better. There's about 12,000 fintech startup companies that last year got $111.8 billion of investment, which is double the year before, to change the way in which finance works. And the banks are part of those investors and part of those companies working with these startups. Say, we can see you can do some good things and make what we do that's inefficient better. So rather than ignore you, we should work with you and try and make ourselves better. And so there's a lot more collaboration and partnership going on today than ever before. And as I say, in about 10 years, I think a lot of these companies will be fully integrated into the financial ecosystem. So we won't see them as separate, we'll see them as all part of the same system.
And in terms of the cultural outlook, because right now they portray a different culture to somebody observing. What will happen when these entrepreneurs behind these fintechs become accepted as a branch or a part or a body of traditional banks? The expectations, when you talk of a banker, there's an image in your head.
Yeah. It's quite a tough one because the culture of the fintech startup is very different to the culture of the bank. And I talk about it as a parent-child relationship because most banks are run by people like me, grey hair, wrinkles, fat stomachs, few years around. Yes, so the average age of a banking C-level executive is going to be around the mid-50s, whereas the average age of a fintech startup entrepreneur is in mid-20s. I often cite the fact that one of the biggest fintech unicorns is Stripe, And it was started by two brothers from Ireland, John and Patrick Conson, when they were 21 and 19 years old. Ethereum, which is becoming the backbone of the infrastructure for distributed ledger and blockchain, was written by a 19-year-old called Vitalik Buterin. So these kids who can code have these great ideas about how to change the world, and they don't really understand why the world works the way it works because they're young, but they have great vision and great challenge. So they challenge the banking people to say, I think you're full of rubbish. You need to do things better because this isn't the way it should work. One of the challenger banks in Britain is called Loot, created by someone who dropped out of university, 21 years old, Ollie Purdue. But they learn over time that there's a reason why banks work the way they work, which is stability, security, resilience, and that we don't want to have another crisis like 2008. So we've learned over centuries that banking has to be trusted and stable. And that's why it's boring and works in quite a bad way. Again, one of my favourite stats, the average bank deals with 5 times more regulation than the average technology company. So fintech startup, naive, doesn't understand why banks are regulated the way they're regulated, thinks they can change the world, and gradually they start to learn, maybe I need some of the old guys around. And so it's like a parent-child relationship. The tech child starts to ask the bank parent, can you help me to understand this? Can you tutor me, mentor me, nurture me, so I can do this with you rather than against you? And eventually it comes together.
And the shift towards protection of national economies as we see today, and also the effect of 9/11 and the bank crisis of 2008, they've been destabilizing factors to the evolution of fintech in terms of its capabilities and restraints placed by the system currently.
Actually, the 2008 financial crisis fueled fintech further and created the impetus for it to happen. I mean, a lot of fintech growth came post 2008 because a lot of people just got disillusioned with the way banks work. One of the biggest fintech unicorns in Europe is Revolut, and the founder of Revolut is a guy who was working for Lehman Brothers in September 2008. So disillusioned former bankers create fintech unicorns.
That's interesting. Well, we were happy to have you here to discuss some of these things. Our discussion was enlightening, entertaining, revealing, educative. We hope to invite you over for another discussion when the opportunity comes again. We hope you will be here again next year to discuss with us developments in this industry. Thank you very much for coming.
Very nice to meet you, Owen. Take care.